So tonight you might be kind of wondering, why are we looking at the book of Daniel? If we think about what we looked at last week, we saw how Eric brought up that in Revelation, at the very beginning, it tells us that the visions in Revelation and the symbols that are being used, they're all signified. It was symbols, not to be taken literally. But the problem in Revelation that we find is that in that book, there's not a clear interpretation given in the book of Revelation. And so what we're going to find tonight as we go throughout the book of Daniel and elsewhere in Scripture as well, that we'll see that God actually interprets and reveals how to understand the visions and the signs in the book of Revelation. And so just like the book of Revelation, Daniel is also a book full of signs as well. Yet in the book of Daniel, we're actually given the interpretations. Also in the book of Daniel, we're told that it was the visions and the prophecies were of things that were going to come hereafter, the things that would come to pass after the time of Daniel, similar to what we saw last week when we looked at John and the things that must shortly come to pass, as we see here in Revelation 1 verse 1. And so as we look at the timeline here, we see that really the prophecies of Daniel that we were looking at take place from that time of him receiving the prophecies, and they extend all the way out into the time of Revelation and extend as far out as the symbols in Revelation do as well. And so we'll see how that takes place here as we go along tonight. So there is as we'll go, we'll see a clear connection between these two books. And I thought this verse here was kind of fitting for some of the themes and the topics that we're looking at tonight. This is taken from Daniel chapter 2, verses 20 through 22. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his, and he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. So what are we gathering from here is that God is all-knowing. God has all wisdom and might, and that he does reveal the deep and the secret things. So where should we turn? If we're seeking for understanding from something, we should turn to God. And we have his word that we can turn to seek interpretation, and really that is the basis for which we're going to be looking at our class tonight, is looking at the word of God and how do we consider the symbols that we see in the book of Revelation, and also the aspect of him setting up and removing kings. And what we'll see is that throughout time, as the kingdom of men is established and different empires reign, we'll see how God is setting up and removing kings to bring about his purpose on the earth. And as we saw in the previous class that Eric gave as well, that purpose is to fill the earth with men and women who will be in his image and likeness, showing his character. To begin with, I wanted to take a look at the big picture as we're trying to bring these thoughts together. So if we were to just go right to the book of Revelation and not consider anything else in the Bible and try to understand what's being talked about there, we would definitely be very confused. What's important, it's just like reading any book, really. If you were to go to the last chapter of the book and try to understand what had taken place all before that, it would be very difficult. And so what we're going to show here in this chart is that there are several themes that are actually laid out in the very first book of the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And that those things that are initiated in the book of Genesis, we find completed or fulfilled in the book of Revelation. And so we're kind of given a complete picture of what's going to be taking place in between these two books. Or you could look at them as bookends, really. And so just to look at a couple of these, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, you have the serpent that speaks. And we find that in chapter 20, in verse 2 of Revelation, that we find the serpent is restrained. We have a curse imposed in chapter 3 as well of Genesis. And we find a curse is removed in Revelation chapter 22. Many might be familiar with the tree of life that is spoken of in the book of Genesis as well, and the fact that man was driven out of the Garden of Eden after the sin that was committed, and then his access to that tree of life was denied. In Revelation, we find that the access is actually open to the tree of life. And finally, we know that as man was driven out of the Garden of Eden, that first paradise was closed to man. Yet we find in Revelation 21 that a new paradise is opened unto him. So you can see these very real connections here. And so everything that we look at in between is the fulfillment, or how do we get to that end point? How does that purpose realize that God has? We turn to Genesis chapter 10, and we're going to be considering a man named Nimrod. In Genesis chapter 10, this man Nimrod, it was said that the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And Eric brought up Babel last week, and how Babel was really built in opposition to God. You had men seeking to not be scattered upon the face of the earth when God's plan was for man to fill the earth. And so in this opposition, you have this man Nimrod here. This city of Babel, this kingdom, is the central to the beginning of his empire. And this man was very much into empire building. After he builds Babel and several other cities in that area, he then moves on to Assyria. He builds Nineveh, other famous cities, Akkad and Calah. And so you can see the beginnings of the way in which the kingdom of men will work. He goes and begins to conquer more and more territory. Also, what's interesting about the man Nimrod is what his name means. His name means rebel, or we will rebel. So think about that in the context of the way in which Babel was built. These people were rebelling against what God had commanded them to do. And finally, just in context, that this Babel is translated the same. The Hebrew word that is translated here, Babel, is translated the same as Babylon all throughout Scripture, and is also incorporating, you'll find the land of Shinar is also consistent throughout the Bible in mentioning of Babel and Babylon. So really when we talk about Babel, we're talking about Babylon here. And we're told 4 times in the Bible that Nimrod is mighty. We're told that he was a mighty one in the earth, or he was mighty upon the earth. This word mighty is really has an implication of like a warrior or a tyrant, someone of that nature. And it's mentioned of, as Eric brought out last week again, that you had the sons of God who went into the daughters of men. You had the seed of the serpent, the seed of the woman, and from them came these children. And we're told that they were mighty men, the same word. And we know that after that time there was great violence upon the earth, and the flood was sent. And so it's in the context of this word that we find Nimrod here described as 4 different times as this mighty one in the earth. It's also in the second point there that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord, or in the face of the Lord, is really how it should read. So again, opposition to God. And finally, him being a mighty hunter. So if you think about what a hunter actually does, to be a good hunter, you'd have to think like the animal. You have to be able to track the animal, right? So you're thinking like the beasts. And we're going to find a link to that later in our class here, of the thinking of the beasts, which really, if you think about it, go back to Genesis in chapter 3, and what was it that was the problem in the Garden of Eden and the dealing with the serpent was the thinking of the beast. They listened to what the serpent had to say, and they listened to his thinking. That's going to play on further as we continue in our class today. And so, considering the origins of the kingdom of Babylon, we're going to jump forward now to Babylon in its peak prime condition. This was the pinnacle of the empire, and this is in the book of Daniel. This is just a little background of just some of the things that take place in the book of Daniel. This was recorded by Daniel, who was a prophet during Jewish captivity in Babylon. He was a Jew. First, it was the Assyrians who came down and took the northern 10 tribes of Israel, and afterwards it was Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon who came and took the remaining 2 tribes in the south. And Daniel was taken away during that time frame back into Babylon. And the book starts out showing how he refused to be assimilated into Babylon. This man, it's a very good showing of his character in the fact that he would not listen to or be infused with the culture of Babylon. And it's something that we should all take heart of as well, thinking about the aspects of Nimrod and the kingdom of men and the opposition to God. He would not be assimilated into this culture and into that thinking. He also became a man of high regard as a wise man and an interpreter in those kingdoms, both in the kingdom of Babylon and also in the kingdom that would follow that. And it was really through, again, God's interpretations which he gave unto Daniel, which led to this elevation in the kingdom of Babylon. And finally, just kind of as a big summary, he receives visions. And these visions are visions of events that are going to come regarding Israel, regarding the nations around Israel, regarding the world in general, and also regarding Christ's return and the setting up of Christ's kingdom. And so in Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar, the king who reigned around 606 BC, he had a terrible dream. And this dream shook him to his core. He wanted to know not only the interpretation, but he wanted to know what the dream actually was from his wise men as well. So he goes to his wise men. He says, I know before you give me interpretations of different signs and things, but now I want you to tell me exactly what the dream was as well. This was such a stirring dream that he had that he wanted to know a clear and true interpretation. And if they couldn't give it to him, he was going to slay them all. And so Daniel hears of this, and he goes to his God and he prays. And God reveals unto him the dream and the interpretation. No one else in the kingdom, none of the wise men of Babylon, could understand or interpret the dream, but God gave this to Daniel. And so here we find what Nebuchadnezzar saw. So you see here this bright, glorious image that he sees. It starts off with this brilliant head of fine gold. Following that, you have the chest and the arms of silver. You have the belly and thighs of brass that follow that. You have the legs of iron. And finally, at the bottom, you have the feet and the toes, which are made of clay and iron mingled together. And so in this image, what we're going to find is that we're actually given the interpretation in Daniel chapter 2. We're actually told exactly what this image represents. And we're told that in these different metals, we'll find kingdoms. And we're told that Nebuchadnezzar is that head of gold. His kingdom is the head of gold. And that there would be 3 kingdoms that would succeed his kingdom. And so we begin with Babylon, 606 BC to 536 BC. The head of gold, the pinnacle. After that, the next great empire that followed after Babylon was that of the Medes and the Persians. And they reigned from 536 to 330 BC. And hence also you look at the fact that there's 2 arms there. So you had 2 different bodies coming together as a confederacy that conquered Babylon. Who was the next great empire after that of the Medes and the Persians? Alexander the Great. You have the Greek Empire, 330 BC to 63 BC. Many of us are probably pretty familiar about the conquest of Alexander the Great and the speed at which he was able to take over the Persians and the vast territory that they had. What was the next great empire after Greece? Rome, 63 BC to 1789 AD. Notice you have the long legs of Rome there. And look at how much longer that time period is of the Roman Empire and the length of its reign. You could look at different dates for the fall of Rome as it was declining over a period of time. This 1789 is around the French Revolution and the conquest of Napoleon, which really brought an end to the base of the Roman rule at the time when the Holy Roman Empire was overthrown. And finally, what do you have? You have the feet of iron and clay mingled. And we have 1789 to really today. You have that representative of Europe. From going down this image, you can see how the metals are deteriorating. You start with the fine gold, you go down to the silver, to the brass, to the iron, and then finally to the weakest point, to the feet of iron and clay. And you would have also 10 toes on this image as well. So you can look at the divisions of the different territories throughout Europe, and the fact that from now on you would have the ruler who is symbolic of that iron having to get power from the people, from the clay. And so you can think of democracy and socialism, some of those other things that take place as a result of the deterioration of these metals. So you start off with Nebuchadnezzar having all rule and power and authority, able to overturn and do whatever he wanted in this monarchy. You go down to the silver, and in the Medes and the Persians Empire, we actually read of it in Daniel chapter 6, that a law was put into place which actually would have brought about the death of Daniel. And the king had his lawyers all night looking to see how he could overturn the law, but he couldn't. He couldn't do anything against the laws that they had. So you can see a limit in the power there. Also Greece. What we'll be looking at later is that after Alexander the Great, in his short reign, his empire was divided into 4 different territories that was reigned over by 4 generals. So again, you have a separation of powers. In Rome, you have the Eastern and the Western Roman Empire, symbolic of the 2 legs that we see there. And so you have 2 different capital cities. You have that of Rome and that of Constantinople also in the east. And so we can see how this continually deteriorates over time, and finally you find that of the feet of the iron and the clay. And now continuing in this vision, we see that there is a rock that is taken out of a mountain without hands. And this rock comes and it smites the image upon the feet. And we're told here in Daniel chapter 2, verse 35, "Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away, and that there was no place found for them." So you have a destruction of this image here. You have this destruction of this lineage of the kingdom of men. Now, what is this stone cut out without hands? Well, it's giving the idea of something that men has no involvement in. And what would that be? But who could this be but Christ? For it was God through the power of the Holy Spirit who brought about his birth into the world. And so it is Christ who will come. And what we're looking at here is Armageddon, the smiting of the image, and the crushing of this kingdom of men. And so we see that they're broken to pieces together, and it's like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, the wind carrying them away. One of the point I want to make up was that they're all broken together. So what we're looking for is a unification of these kingdoms as well at the time of Armageddon. This isn't just one part of the metal of the image that is being consumed or broken. It is the entire image broken together. And we're going to see the importance of that in the few slides from now. So in thinking again about the chaff and the threshing floors, Eric brought this point up last week in his class. And we looked at how Armageddon in the Hebrew tongue means heap of sheaves in a valley for judgment. And we saw in Joel how these same themes are brought about, the gathering of nations, and that these nations will be gathered together, and there will be judgment in this valley of Jehoshaphat, which means the Lord has judged. And we see the links to putting in the sickle and the harvesting. And so when you think about this harvesting of wheat, bringing the sheaves of wheat into the threshing floor, the crushing of the wheat, and then you'd have it lifted up into the air, and the wind would carry away the chaff. And really what you have is separation. You have a judgment taking place. And so we have direct links from what we're looking at here, the threshing floors, the judgment, the crushing that is taking place of this image, and what we saw in our Armageddon last week. And so we can see a direct correlation to what we were talking about. So let's consider these empires that we're looking at in the territories. So we begin with the Babylonian Empire, really focusing around the Fertile Crescent area here, Tigris and Euphrates, and continuing down along the eastern side of the Red Sea. And so that's what we're looking at when we're looking at the territory of the kingdom of Babylon. Next, we find the MEO Persian Empire. You can see the way in which much more was conquered. Look at the vast expanse of land here. It goes all the way out into to Libya and to Egypt in the south. As far west as Macedonia at times. The borders kind of varied throughout history. North up into the Caucasus Mountains, and all the way east, almost up into the Indus River. So the Greek Empire, which followed that, same territory, but you see even more is covered. This goes all the way out as far west as all the way out into Greece, and continues out even east further as well. So you see this empire continually growing. Now we see a little different picture actually when we get to the Roman Empire. So here you see that it extends much further out west than those of the previous empires. It extends all the way out to Britain up here in the west, and Spain, and the whole northern tip of Africa there is covered as well of this kingdom. But you notice as well that the Far East territory was not conquered by the Romans. So that territory was not taken in. But what's interesting is that this same territory of Babylon was continually under power of these successive kingdoms, which I think is an interesting point. And so what we're looking at when we're talking about that this stone being cast and destroying together all these metals in this image of the kingdom of men is we're looking for a coalition, we're looking for a unification, a gathering of these nations unto the great battle in the day of Armageddon. So up until now, we've been considering in Daniel chapter 2 a vision that was seen by a Gentile king, and really you could look at it as man's view of the kingdom of men. This great and glorious image, these bright metals, and really something to behold. We're going to see a vastly different picture in Daniel chapter 7, and what we're going to see is direct links back to Daniel chapter 2. And so what does he see? In Daniel chapter 7, we read that he receives this vision by night. And behold, the four winds of the heaven strove upon the great sea. And 4 great beasts came up from the sea, diverse, one from another. And so we're going to be considering these 4 different beasts and how they correspond to what we looked at in Daniel chapter 2. And so what we can look at in Daniel chapter 7 is a man of God beholding these visions that God gives unto him. And this is God's view of the kingdom of men. Notice these beasts. Remember before we were thinking about Nimrod, the thinking of the beast, and how that was indicative of the kingdom of men. How does God perceive the kingdom of men? These are beasts ruling in the kingdom. And so this is God's view. And notice that all these beasts, what we'll see is that they're all unnatural in some way. You have the lion with wings. You have the leopard having 4 heads and 4 wings. You have a bear who's lifted up on one side unnaturally. And also you have a 4th and dreadful beast, which actually can only be described by its characteristics. There's not even a creature in God's creation that could be described by this 4th and dreadful and terrible beast. And so what we're going to see is that these 4 beasts actually line directly up to what we've seen in Daniel chapter 2. The Babylonian head of gold is representative of that lion. The MEO Persian chest and arms of silver seen as the bear. We have the belly and thighs depicting a leopard, and those Roman legs of iron, and also the feet and toes of iron and clay are shown to correspond to the 4th beast, which had 10 horns. It makes you think back to the feet, which would have 10 toes on them as well. And we'll dive into these now and consider how these link together. So we'll begin with the lion. Daniel chapter 7, verse 4. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given unto it. And so this lion, as you go back to the image that we looked at before of this head of gold, represents both the Assyrian and the Babylonian empires. It's looking at it in more detail than what we saw before. And we'll see that continue on as we go throughout this class. We were first given that first image, and then what we'll find is in Daniel chapter 7, we're given even more detail. And if we won't go there, but in Daniel chapter 8, you're given even more detail about the kingdoms that we're looking at, here as well. And so this line, representative of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, and again, the origins back in Daniel chapter 10, speaking of Nimrod. Remember, he went from creating cities around in Babylon, going out to Assyria and further establishing his empire. And so this lion having eagle's wings, speaking of the outreach, the overshadowing of the great territory that the Assyrians had. And a number of famous Assyrian kings that you can think of Tiglath-Pileser, Shalmaneser, Sennacherib, several that we find in the Bible here. Most of the time they're opposition to Israel as well, as they came down and took the northern 10 tribes of Israel. And we find that those wings are plucked up. And so believe this is indicative of, in history we find that Assyria was defeated by a Babylon and Median confederacy in 612 BC. So you have this territory that was taken by that was conquered by the Assyrians, taken away by a Babylonian and Median confederacy. And so what do you have? You have a changing of rule. And so you have a lifting up of the lion, which is the ascending to the throne in the kingdom of men of this Babylonian empire, which reigned from 606 BC to 536 BC. And also when you think about a lion as well, it's thought of as the king of all beasts typically. Think of the king of the jungle. And so this is the peak beast would correspond directly with the head again, as we're considering. And so we're looking back in history and seeing how these things, how these different symbols take place. And finally, a man's heart was given unto it. And it's commonly known throughout history that the Assyrians were absolutely brutal in the conquerings of nations. And the Babylonians were known to be much more humane than those of the Assyrians. And the fact that just in looking at the example that Daniel and the best and the brightest of Israel were actually taken in and try to assimilate into the Babylonian culture rather than simply just being destroyed. And so here, let's look at some images from history. And what we find is very common in the palaces in Assyria, in the different kingdoms or cities. You'd find these which are called lamassus. And what you have is a body of a lion. You have wings, and you have a head of a man here. Okay, so these things were extremely common in the Assyrian king's palaces. Okay, so there you go back to the imagery that looked at with a lion with wings. Then what do you find when you come to Babylon? So if you were to walk into Babylon through the Ishtar gate, you would continue down a procession hall, and you can see different replicas of this in various places in the world. And down that procession hall, you would see hundreds of lions, and all these lions were lions without wings. And so it's really interesting to see how these things portray throughout history, that you find these same images in the palaces of Assyria with a lion with wings, and you find the lion without wings in the courts of Babylon. And you have those wings removed there. This might be a little bit difficult to bring out. I've circled some areas here for you to see. This is what you call a stone sculpture or a mural of sorts that was found in the palace of King Tiglath-Pileser, one of the more brutal kings of Assyria. And what it's depicting, kind of going back to the brutality of the Assyrians, is down here in the bottom you have an Assyrian soldier who was slitting the throat of a unarmed enemy here, and up in the top right corner you have the prisoners who are impaled upon stakes, and these were found throughout their palaces, showing their conquests and the ways in which they would deal with the people that they conquered. And you can even read more about it if you wanted to, about they would skin people alive. There's others showing the putting out of eyes and several other brutal things that they would do. So this going back to the man's heart being given into Babylon, and the more humane aspect that they had than the Assyrians. So we consider Daniel chapter 7, verse 5. And behold, another beast, a second, like unto a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it, between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. And so we saw the bear corresponds to that of the MEO Persian Empire, reigning from 536 BC to 330 BC, again in succession to that of the Babylonian Empire. You might be familiar with the way in which Cyrus went to the city of Babylon and dried up the river Euphrates, and from there was able to go in and conquer that city. Very famous story from record from history. And so after that conquering, in the first 2 years, it was Cyrus who gave the rulership to his uncle Darius the Mede. And after Darius died, Cyrus was the one who became head ruler and really the sole ruler. And you then have basically this raising up on one side. This is an action that's taking place. And so where once you had the Medes in power, Darius the Mede in power for 2 years, you have the raising up on one side, the ascendancy of power by the Persians, leading with Cyrus here. And that's the action that we're seeing in history. The 3 ribs that are in the mouth of it, we actually read of in Daniel chapter 6, that there were 3 territories, and these territories that were conquered by the Medes and the Persians after conquering Babylon, and that there were 3 presidents who ruled over these 3 territories. Daniel was the chief of these princes, of these 3 princes. We read that in Daniel chapter 6. Sorry, not princes, presidents, excuse me. There's 3 presidents, and there's 127 princes that kind of facilitated things underneath them. So this is speaking of those 3 ribs in the mouth, those territories conquered, with the 3 presidents set over to rule those territories and to oversee the affairs of those territories as well. And finally, the arise and devour much flesh. Well, we saw from the maps that the MEO Persian Empire conquered vastly more land and territory than that of the Babylonians. And so here we have the connections between the arms and chest of silver and the bear. 538 BC, Darius reigning for 2 years, that one arm of the image, and then changing to the other arm of Cyrus the Persian, ascending up, being raised up on one side, taking power throughout the rest of the empire's existence. You have the Persians, that influence being much more dominant. And then as we looked at the division of the empire in the conquering of the 3 different provinces and 3 presidents reigning over those. And what's interesting is in the British Museum, you can find these plates that are made of silver, and depicted on these plates are the conquest of the Babylonian Empire. And what do you find him holding here? He has knives or swords in the heads of lions. And you have him standing on a lion here. And so again, going back to the conquering of the previous kingdom, what was that kingdom? Babylon, representative of the lion. So we move on to the leopard of Greece. Daniel chapter 7, verse 6. After this I beheld, and lo, another, like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast had also 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. We're going to see how this is in connection, this leopard, to that of the Greek Empire, 330 BC to 63 BC, the next great empire that followed that of the Medes and the Persians. And there was 2 great battles that Alexander the Great won against the Persians to conquer that empire, that of Granicus and of Isis. And really the speed at which that Alexander was able to conquer the vast territory of the MEO Persian Empire was amazing, doing that in about 3 years. And so these 4 wings of a fowl, speaking of how far that those territories were conquered, as well as the speed of which that those territories were conquered. And then we see 4 heads, which, as we mentioned before, you have the Greek Empire divided into 4 different territories as well. And you have, after Alexander's death, after his very early death, he was very young, 4 generals were set up after him, and they were ruling over those 4 different territories. And so here we see the 4 different heads of the leopard, and we see how history fulfills that. And finally, great dominion was given unto it. And as we saw previously in the maps as well, that the empire and the territory with which the Greeks ruled was spread even further than that of the MEO Persian Empire. And again, we kind of bring all this together. We look at the belly and the thighs of brass, the leopard with its 4 heads and the 4 wings, showing the 4 territories, the 4 generals over those territories, the great dominion, and Daniel chapter 2, verse 39, speaking of the 3rd kingdom, which shall bear rule over all the earth. It was truly a vast territory that was conquered by Alexander the Great. And what's interesting here, again, in the British Museum, we see brass is actually typical of the Greek Empire. In fact, they were the first empire to extensively use brass in the making of their armor for their army. Other nations before had done so, but not on the scale of the Greeks. They really took it to the next level. And so here we have a picture of all the different armaments of brass used by the Greeks. And so finally we come to the 4th beast. Daniel 7, verse 7. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it. And it had 10 horns. And so as we know, it was the Roman Empire that followed that of the Greek Empire. And so, again, we said 63 BC to 1789 AD. And the great devouring of this beast was, again, you saw the vast territory that was encompassing all the way west into Britain, into Gaul, and going east into Macedonia, Egypt, and even Pergamum here was actually willingly given over to the Romans, which they didn't actually have to conquer that area. What we're going to look at here is the combination of Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, and how it's very easy to see the consistency in the language being used here, the inspired language. So you have iron, great teeth of iron. What do we have? The 4th kingdom, strong as iron breaketh in pieces and subdueth all things. As iron that breaketh all these, shall it break in pieces and bruise. So again, a theme of breaking in pieces. We find the same thing, Daniel chapter 7, verse 7. We have the stamping of the residue. And so what do we find also? 10 horns in Daniel chapter 7. And so we can see the correlation between that of the 4th beast and that of the legs and the legs of iron and the feet of iron and of clay. And so what do we find after we see this 4th beast? Well, we have a judgment on the beast. This kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? We saw a similar thing when we were looking at Daniel chapter 2. We saw the smiting of the image. Before, when speaking about the rock, I forgot to mention the fact that the rock smites the image, and it then becomes a great mountain, and it fills the entire earth. Sorry, I forgot that. A very important point. So that rock, representative of Christ, in the conquering in the smiting of this kingdom of men, then grows and fills the entire earth, speaking of the kingdom of God that will be upon the earth. And so what do we find here? The same exact language being used. Daniel chapter 7, verse 26. But the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and to destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. And so we see this kingdom, this dominion taken away from that of the fourth beast, that reign that was given. And we have it replaced by the reign of Christ and the kingdom of God established on the earth. So again, consistency. And so you could continue on, as I mentioned, Daniel chapter 8, you find even more detail given. You have other beasts mentioned, and more detail given about the time of the Greeks and the Medes. And again, those are even called out, and we were given interpretation as well. We don't have time tonight to go into those. We're going to stick with these first two. And what we find as we go into Daniel chapter 12 is that, interesting enough, we find that there's a book that is sealed. Daniel chapter 12, verse 4. But thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book, even to the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. And continuing on in just 5 verses down, and he said, Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. So we have this picture of this book that contained all the words that were written. So all these things, all these visions that have been recorded by Daniel, and you have the sealing of this book, and it's going to be sealed until the time of the end. So we got this vision. Okay, got that. So what do we find in Revelation? Revelation chapter 5, verse 1. And I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book, written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. We just saw that in Daniel, didn't we? We saw the book sealed, and now we find this book here. And we continue in verses 4 and 5 of Revelation 5. And I wept much because no man was found worthy to open and to read the book, neither to look thereon. And one of the elders saith unto me, Weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof. So what do we find in Revelation? We find an opening of the book, the seals being taken off at the time of the end. And at this time of the end, really, it's the end of the of Israel as a nation, really, as Revelation is written around AD 96. And so it's interesting that we find ourselves here in the this would be during the time of the legs of iron here of the Roman rule. And so what do we find when we go in Revelation? Well, we find that Daniel's fourth beast actually reemerges. In Revelation chapter 12, we can see a direct correlation to the beast which we saw in Daniel, to the fourth beast that we saw in Daniel chapter 7. Both of them great or strong exceedingly, having iron teeth, both of them ready to devour, both of them having 10 horns, and stamping the residue and making war with the remnant that is left. Similar language being used there. You have the persecution of the woman, which throughout the Bible you look at the bride and you think of the bride of Christ. So which is typical of the church. And so you have the persecution of the saints mentioned in Daniel chapter 7. Both of them blasphemous, and both of these beasts existing until Christ. And so as we look at Daniel chapter 12, what do we find in the next chapter in Revelation? Revelation chapter 13. And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, and his seat and great authority. Seems like we've seen some of these symbols before, haven't we? So we have a beast rising up out of the sea. Where did we see that? That was Daniel chapter 7, right? We had 4 beasts rising up out of the sea, one after another. Okay? Here we have 10 horns being mentioned. We thought back to the 10 horns that were on that 4th beast. And finally, a leopard, a bear, and a lion, and a dragon. You know what's interesting is that only 3 times in the Bible do you find a leopard, a bear, and a lion mentioned together. 3 times. The first is in Daniel. The last one, the third one, is here in Revelation 13. And we find the second one here in Hosea chapter 13. Hosea 13, verses 7 through 8. Therefore I will be unto them as a lion, as a leopard. By the way will I observe them. I will meet them as a bear that is bereaved of her whelps, and I will rend the caul of their heart. And there will I devour them like a lion. The wild beast shall tear them. So this is speaking about judgment that will take place upon God's people, upon Judah. And so in thinking about this judgment taking place, what is he going to bring upon his people? It's mentioned as being a lion or a leopard or a bear, and even a fourth unnamed wild beast. It sounds very familiar, doesn't it? And this coincides with exactly what we saw with the kingdoms who would bear rule over God's people. Babylon taking his people captive. The MEO Persians as well having dominion over them. The Greek Empire. The Roman Empire. This is consistent, isn't it? So this is the only other place. There's 3 places. All of these here speaking of these kingdoms that we've been looking at. Or really the kingdom of men. These different empires that would reign in that kingdom. And so what are we seeing when we go to Revelation is really different phases of Daniel's 4th beast. So we see, as we saw, we have the first of it coming out in Revelation chapter 12 with the great red dragon. Then you have the beast of the sea, the beast of the earth, the image of the beast. And finally in Revelation 17 you have the harlot which sits on the beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. And so what we have is the different progressions in the kingdom of men of really that 4th beast. So we're seeing even greater detail given of the 4th beast, those seals being opened that were shut at the time of Daniel. And Daniel actually, in that book as well, was very inquisitive of this 4th beast. Of all the beasts that he saw, it was the 4th beast that he focused on for the great and the terrible things that came out of that 4th beast. And it's here in Revelation chapter 16 where we find Armageddon. So this is where the judgments begin. This is where the conquests begin. And so here we're going to bring all the things that we looked at, and we're going to bring them together. And what is the full view that we've been looking at tonight? So we started in Daniel chapter 2, the great image, the view of the kingdom of men from man's view, the head of gold. And we saw how that was representative of that lion that we saw in Daniel chapter 7. And next, the arms of silver, that of the bear, the belly and thighs, representative of the leopard. And we have the feet of iron and clay, pointing forward to that of the great 4th beast that we saw in Daniel chapter 7. And so progressing further, and again, remember in each one of these, here we were given an image with various details, and then here in Daniel 7 we were given even more details about those things that would come to pass in the kingdom of men, okay? And then finally in Revelation, and here we just have a couple of these images of the red dragon and the beast of the sea in Revelation 12 and 13. What we have is even further detail given in Revelation. So that is what we're looking at when we consider the book of Revelation. And so here it is, the whole picture. We have the progression of the kingdom of men throughout the ages as detail is given more and more as we go. Why is it that we see the 4th beast in Revelation? Well, again, there's no more metals to come at the time of the writing of John in Revelation. Remember, this was AD 90, 96, whatever you want to call it. And all the previous metals had come before it. All that followed, he was in the time of the iron, and it was just the iron mixed with clay afterwards. And we see how that corresponds to the 4th beast. So why is it so we have an exposition of the 4th beast, basically, of Daniel's 4th beast in Revelation, and that's what we're looking at as the different phases as history progresses. These are consistencies that we can see throughout the Bible. And again, we've turned and looked to, as we're considering Revelation, we're turning and looking to what God says about how to interpret and how to understand these signs that we see. And we've seen by going back what these beasts represent. And so we started with the kingdom of men in Daniel chapter 2 as Nebuchadnezzar's image. And we saw that that image was then crushed by the stone. And so we have the judgment that was brought upon the kingdom of men. And finally, you have the kingdom of God. And that was that stone that then grew into a mountain and filled the entire earth. Well, we saw the same exact thing in Daniel chapter 7, didn't we? We have the beast, the representative of the kingdom of men. We have that 4th beast slain. And what's interesting again is that you have the image being crushed upon the feet, which as well have iron. In Daniel chapter 7, you have the 4th beast being slain, which as well had the iron teeth. So we see a consistency there. And finally, at the end of that, we have the saints having dominion over all the earth. Same picture. What do we find in Revelation? We have the dragon and the beast, as we just saw, a continuation of the symbols used in Daniel chapter 7. We find a judgment. There's various conquests that are mentioned. Revelation 16, 18, 19. Revelation 16 again is speaking of Armageddon. Armageddon is the beginning of Christ's conquest over the kingdom of men, over the beast. And finally, what do we find at the end of Revelation? We find New Jerusalem. We see the paradise reopened. We see the kingdom of God on earth. And so again, you can see the real connections here, the consistent message that God is giving us, and that He has given us the interpretation of. And so as we think back to how we ended our last class of Armageddon, why? Well, what we've seen from our previous slides is that God is setting up a kingdom on this earth, isn't He? And it is necessary that the kingdom of men be judged and replaced by that kingdom of God. And Armageddon is the beginning of those conquests. Armageddon is the beginning of that judgment process. And so here we'll end with Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever.